So let me introduce you to the panel. To my far right, we have the Reverend Karen Sethuraman. Karen is the first female Baptist minister in Ireland and is currently the pastor of Soul Space, a peace and reconciliation hub based in Belfast. Beside Karen, we have Alison Morris, who's the crime correspondent and columnist with the Belfast Telegraph. And you'll also see and hear Alison contribute to many TV and radio programmes when she's specialising in politics and security as well. Beside Alison, we have Coumilah Manjoo, who is originally from Mauritius, and she's lived here for the last 12 years, and she's studied various fields of social sciences as an undergrad and holds a master's degree in human rights. And sprung off the bench, coming in at the last minute in place of Amy Mackin, who sadly can't be with us today, we have Dorinnia Carville, who is the acting CEO of the council, and she's an accountant by background, has worked in public and private practice, and she's a mother of 3 as well. So welcome to everyone. A round of applause for our panel. So Karen, over to you, far away. Hiya. Tell me, what's your notion of breaking the bias? When you hear that phrase, what comes to your mind? And how have you seen bias towards women manifest itself in your world?
Well, first of all, let me take this opportunity to thank you for the privilege and honour of being here. I'm so delighted to be able to put my beautiful dress on today. I didn't have a lovely option. Any designers out there that want to redesign clergy wear, give me a call. I'm just going to share a funny story just to begin with, because it'll kind of set the scene for what I want to say. I was heading to the city hospital to visit some friends who were there. And I had my clergy wear on, and I stopped at a petrol station to put petrol into the car. And the guy who was at the cashier said, "Next, please, next." And then he looked at me like this. And I wasn't sure if he was looking at me, so I'm looking around me going, I said, "Are you okay?" And he went, Are you a female minister? And I was going, I have no idea what gives it away. No idea what gives it away. And that's the bias that I live with day in and day out. I'm a woman of faith. I grew up in the Baptist tradition. I grew up in a tradition that values women, but not enough to be at the leadership table. And so for me, in the faith arena, I am really passionate about paving the way, about bringing alternative voices to the table, voices that are female-led as well. And that's the bias that I deal with every day. So I know what it is to, as my mentor said to me 20 years ago, welcome to the boys' club. I know what it is to be excluded. I know what it is to be dismissed. I know what it is for male clergy to not want to share a platform with me. And I think one of the ladies said this earlier, and this is important, this isn't about male bashing, because the reality is there are a lot of great guys who stand with me and who champion me, but this is about, stepping up and stepping into what I believe is all our rightful place, which is to be equal in whatever arena we're in and to champion breaking the bias that we find ourselves in.
Thank you, Karen. Alison, as Karen said there, she's dealing with that bias every single day because she's in a man's world. You are most definitely in a man's world dealing with crime and security. So, can you give me your everyday experiences of the bias?
Well, when I first started doing crime and security, probably nearly 20 years ago now, it was a completely male world. And, I always joke, if you look through the contacts on my phone, 90% of them are men, because I'm dealing predominantly with people in the criminal justice system and also criminals. A lot of the men that I used to have to interview had balaclavas on at one point. And going into that very male, very macho world as a woman, you seen that there was a lot of bias, but in some ways too, it could serve you well because they were less intimidated by you. Maybe it would have been more dangerous had it been a man. But the bias that I can see that you need to break down, a lot of the abuse that I would get is gendered, it's gender central, and it's centred, and it's the fact that I am a woman, and therefore where my male colleagues might get abuse or threats, theirs is never of a sexual nature, and that would be the kind of abuse that I get. And also you don't just get that from men who you would consider, men on the internet or whatever, but from men in obviously professional men and men in our profession, and men who sometimes think that, they should be doing my job instead of me, and so they would, as well. You would be a lot of sort of sexual innuendo and all sorts of other things coming from them. But I think in terms of the bias, I always think of, our grandmother's generation were subjected to, a place where church and state could hardly be separated, mother and baby homes, young pregnant women being treated like a contagion. Then my mother's generation, and when you think of what they had to go through as well, and the bias that existed there, just especially too when you consider that we were in a conflict generation and, an armed patriarchy, as it was called, and the women were often the forgotten victims of that. But what happened was those women campaigned and they left a place better. They left it better for me. And that's what I think of breaking the bias. I have 2 daughters who are 2 young women now. I have a young granddaughter. And I always think that the way we break the bias is we leave the place better than we found it. So my mother, when she finally goes, she'll have left this world a better place than she found it, because she made sure that her daughters were educated. She made sure, that they wouldn't face the discrimination that she faced. And my daughters will, inherit a much better world than the one I had. And it's their job and their duty, and I tell them this often, to make sure that they leave the place better than they found it. So that's how we help each other, and that's how we break the bias.
And Coumilah, you're coming at it from a completely different perspective. But interestingly, you came here from Mauritius, so I imagine, there's bias there before we even mention anything else. And then you also specialise in the education sector. So tell me about your experience with the bias and how you would like to see the bias being broken.
Merci beaucoup de m'avoir ici et de me recevoir cet après-midi pour voir tout le monde. Now, I want to ask you,
Walter wrote.
do you speak French? This is what it feels like for me every single day. No matter where I am, there's already an assumption that I don't speak the language. But I could have a conversation with you in 5 different languages. And this is what I want you to think every time you look at someone who looks like me or who looks different to you, that these people come with all of these stories. They know a whole different language, the grammar, the sentence structure. And you all know, most of you have learned a different language in high school, but you don't remember it now. And you know how hard it's been to learn the grammar, the sentence structure, to be able to write it, to speak it. But these people know these things. So any time that you're going to be speaking to someone with a broken English, think about that she would be able to answer you in a whole different language. He or she would be able to do that. Now, when we talk about break the bias, I've been quite skeptic about this, but I've had to learn the hard way. When I grew up, Brenda was talking about things that when you grew up. When I grew up, my family taught me that there was nothing I couldn't do. I always thought that I was going to be a lawyer, or in that sense, but maybe it's because I argue a lot with my mom and dad, that's why they thought that. But there was nothing I couldn't do. I traveled the world. I lived in France, I lived in England, I lived down south. But Northern Ireland has been a totally different ball game altogether. It's the place where I raised my children, but it's also the place where I've been abused. Whether it was in the public sphere, in school, at uni, at work, in my own home, this is where I faced it all, Northern Ireland. So despite being here 12 years, going on 13 years, every year is the year that I'm leaving, but I'm still here. But it's not for the weather, though, but I'm still here. I'm still here. I've made friends and family. It's my children's home. For me, breaking the bias has to be something more than idealistic, has to be something that, not a dream that I will die with. It has to be something that you're not going to wait next year for International Women's Day to have someone like me sitting up here. I want to see everything that you're going to do from now to next year, and you'll be able to say, these are all the things that we've done to actually break the bias and pave the way for women who look like me. And if you look around, if this room is not a representation of the society that we live in, you shouldn't be in that room. Thank you.
Thank you, Coumilah. I think that's a very important notion. I think about International Women's Day, while it provides a very important focus on women's issues and a platform like this, It shouldn't be the one day of the year where women's voices are sought out, where their opinions are sought out, where they are heard, where there's a panic, oh, we need to get a women's event, oh, we need to get the women, and we need to do this, and we need to do that. That should be a regular occurrence. And then on top of that, when it comes to the kind of room you're putting together, it must be a diverse and a representative room. And I think you're right. If we take that forward every day and not just the one day at this same time next year, if we do that, we've already made a difference, I think. And last but not least, on our panel today, we have Dorinnia Carville. Now, Dorinnia, thank you very much for doing this because we completely sprung this on you. Dorinnia is the acting CEO of Newry, Mourne and Down Council, accountant by background. So you've worked in public and private sector. Tell me about your experience of breaking the bias in the business world, if you like.
Yeah. So I suppose I started off my working life over 20 years ago, and in a very male-dominated environment, in a big four accountancy firm in London. And as a woman, you walked in there, and it was, I'm looking around this room of colour, and it was all men in dark suits, and even the women were in dark suits, because even the fashion then was that's really all there was for us to wear to work, then too. But I suppose from my perspective, I've seen a lot of change over the last 20 years. There's still a lot to do, but I've been quite fortunate. I've had opportunity, and I think as well, I think sometimes it's about the small things as well as the big things. The changes in our chamber even. We have a lot of women now in public life as well, and I think it is just constantly challenging the barriers as women, and it's small things. I still sometimes today walk into meetings. I was having a conversation with our councillors about this recently, and if I walk in with some males, it's maybe assumed I'm there to take the notes, that I'm going to be the one who pours the tea. These very, very small little things that I think we need to just challenge on a very small level. But there's still barriers to break down.
So when you talk about challenging things, every single one of you have brought up so much that we want to go back to. And I think yourself and Coumilah there have touched on something about, representation, visibility. And funny, when I was preparing to talk to Amy Mackin, I was going to talk in terms of the Ladies Gaelic Football Association's campaign of can't see, can't be, and that you need to see women in certain jobs all the time to recognise I could do that, I could be that person. We need these mentors, we need that sort of leadership and visibility. But when does visibility become assimilation? You said about with walking into a room full of dark suits. Sometimes women feel that they have to be like the men in order to be taken seriously when they're completely different. Have you experienced that in your world? And how difficult is it to be individual and to be true to yourself?
Absolutely, and I think it is changing. I suppose years ago, I remember actually, so I was working in this very corporate world, working really long hours, and there was I was 21 years of age, had no thoughts at that stage of family or anything, of having my own family. And there was a heavily pregnant woman sitting in our team at 11 o'clock at night working, and I remember it then going, I was exhausted as a 21-year-old girl, and I was thinking, God, she must be exhausted. Mm-hmm. 2 days later, she appeared, minus her bump. And again, I thought, oh my goodness, what has happened? No one said anything. And I remember in the break sort of saying to someone, what happened? Oh yeah, she had the baby, but she had to come back to work because she's got designs on being partner, and that's what you have to do. And I remember at 21, feeling, oh my God, that's appalling. But that's what that world was back then. And I suppose there's part of me sitting thinking, that's wrong. Mm. And, if people don't say, well, I need a break, I need some leave, and anything like that, we're not going to break down those barriers. I think the world has come a long way. I do in those sorts of things, but there's still a way to go. There's still those stories,
Still that expectation. And what are your thoughts on, Coumilah? I'm really interested in this, on integration versus assimilation. Coming to a different country, how do you try to make yourself be seen by other people properly, as you properly want to be represented, to be true to yourself?
I think that's something that I talk about a lot, because what is it that we're looking for? Whenever I came here, I brought along all my tradition, my culture, and these are things that I want to pass on to my children as well. But it seems like we're constantly fighting. We want people to learn the language. We want people to behave a certain way. We expect Black and ethnic minority communities to behave a certain way. Are we actually looking at integration or assimilation? What is it that we're wanting? Is there any problem for people to be wearing a certain kind of dress, to have their hair a certain way? Are we even going to school? I know of a lot of Black girls who've been told that they have to cut their hair, boys and girls have to cut their hair, have to tame it to be, but for what? Are we actually respecting people's individuality? I want my daughter to be able to go and to know that she could be, and she's noticed it as well in the past 2 years, and I think even though there was a lot of work that's been done before, the past 2 years there's been a momentum following the death of George Floyd and even the disproportionate impact of COVID on ethnic minority communities. You've seen everybody's rushing to make sure that equality, diversity is included in everything, the posters, but it's not just that. It has to be embedded in all the work that you do. I need my daughter to know that there are people like her that she can dream and believe, not even dream, she can believe that she can do all the things that other people do. But I think as women, we do ourselves a disservice, because instead of building each other up, sometimes we tend to tear each other down. And why are we not paving the way? If you've got up there, why are you not paving the way for others to come? But to come with the stories and everything that they come, rather than being like you. They don't have to be like you. They can be themselves.
Themselves, yeah. It's that tapping into that emotional intelligence and recognising that everybody can be different, and that notion of pulling the ladder up behind you instead of leaving it down for everyone else to ascend after you. It separates women sometimes, doesn't it? Karen and Alison, I know you'll have a lot to say about assimilation and integration, but I want to move on just to another topic very quickly about, because we are running out of time, sadly, women at the table and why it's important for women's voices to be at important tables in talks. We're looking at a disastrous situation in Ukraine and with Russia at the minute. You know, how important are women's voices in peace building, in politics? Why should they be there? Alison, if you want to take that first. I know Karen's going to have a lot to say on that.
And not just, you know, at the table as, oh, we need a woman, because it's come back to what you're saying,
Yeah.
you know, are you being included as the panel as a token? You know, when I first started doing broadcast work, I don't know how many times I was put into a panel and I was the only woman, and you realise when you arrive, that's the only reason why they've asked you to come, because they're embarrassed by the makeup of their wee rodeo that organise between themselves. And I would, you know, show up, and people on social media would go, "Why is Alison, you know, the only woman on that panel?" And I would always joke, because I'm worth like 10 of them. You know, I make up when it takes 10 of them to make one of me. But the fact is that now it isn't just, you want the women out for what they have to say. When you look at our situation and what happened here, and you go back to the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s, and the peace building that went on here, it was those women's groups who were at the heart of the community, who were protecting the young men and women in this community, who were doing the lion's share of the work long before European funding started flooding into this place. These were women who were working on a voluntary basis. They were women who were keeping, you know, the fact that, you know, the domestic violence epidemic that we see now so publicly, that existed then. It was just all hidden. Mm-hmm. And there was groups of women, you know, the people who set up Women's Aid, the people who set up the Rape Crisis Centre, those women who got into those communities and made sure that that was a proper peace that you were building, you know, not just a peace that was negotiated by men sitting around a table, you know, dividing up land between them and who was going to get what out of this peace deal. These were women who, without them, I don't think that, you know, we would have had a proper peace here. And the fact is, I would say, if you change one mother's life, if you empower her, if you give her the ability to educate herself, to get back out to work, you change everything that comes behind her, because you change her children's lives. You know, my mother had no opportunities, but Big Alice, you wouldn't mess with her, and she made sure that we did. What it meant that my children then all went to university and they had a life that I wouldn't have been able to dream of, because when you change one person's life, and this is the same no matter where I've travelled in the world, no matter what country I've visited, you can see if you empower women and if you empower mothers, well then you fix everything that comes behind them, because they will in turn pass that on and empower their children behind them, and that's how you build not just a peace. You know, you need a peace process and a peaceful society, and to build that, it has to be prosperous and it has to include everyone. And I think that that's why women were such an important part, and they weren't written out of that period of history and that period of peace building because they weren't written in. And you know this because when it was the 20th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, they struggled to find women from that time to put on the panel. At that stage, I think, you know, Monica McWilliams' shoes were off her because she was the only woman that they could bring in to sit in those panels. Because when you look back at those old newsreels, apart from Mourne, and you know, and that was it. Who were the other women who were at that table who were negotiating that peace? And when you look at the contribution that Mourne made, what would it have been without her?
Absolutely, absolutely. And Karen, your thoughts on that? Because I know you go ahead. You are very, very passionate about building a peaceful society. How important are women to building peace?
Yeah, well, I mean, this morning I read an article in terms of integrated education, which I am a huge fan of. But it's interesting that it talked about the opposition from the 4 main churches. I want to say this with as much tenderness as I can say. We are bigger than 4 main churches, and we need to create a table that includes all voices, including our sisters from different faiths and people of no faiths at all. I remember someone saying to me, and I think it was Shirley Chisholm said this, if there's no room at the table, bring your folding chair. Listen, I'm tired bringing my folding chair, right? And the reality is it's the whole idea of let's just keep showing up, let's just keep turning up, let's just keep paving a better way. And I know that when we mention clergy, and certainly when you encounter someone who wears a collar, we kind of get our Sister Michael of Derry Girls on, where our eyes is rolling, and you think to yourself, have I woke up in hell when I came here today? But the reality is that the church, and as I said before, I believe that the church needs to be separated from the state, but the teachings of the church, the patriarchal structures, the misogyny that exists within the church affects all of us. It ripples out into our views of men and women, of our education. It ripples out into the views and the attacks of our LGBT plus community. And so it is important that women, in terms of peacemaking, get at this table and make sure we extend conversations in the faith circle beyond the 4 main churches, because we are bigger than the 2 communities. And can I just say this? We are companions, ladies. We are not competitors. And when I talk about bringing a folding chair to the table, that does not mean you have to sit down and live constantly being dismissed, constantly being second-guessed, constantly being undermined or excluded and rejected. Let me tell you, see, if you're at that table, get up, leave it, and create your own table. Because Northern Ireland, we deserve a better future. And I truly am passionate that we have female peacemakers, people of faith and no faith and different faiths, be and create the very community and societies that we want us to be.
Well said, Karen. We are going to wrap up things now, and I know we're leaving you wanting more. Sadly, that's just the timetable has just gone against us this afternoon. But finally, and just to pick up on something you just said there now, Karen, about being at the table. Sometimes when women are at the table, they say nothing because they're afraid to say the wrong thing. And that's true in so many aspects of life. And then you're also afraid of maybe saying too much and walking away and doubting yourself. So for everybody who's in the room now, how can we walk away from this discussion today, this event today, with real, tangible, practical ideas that might just break the bias, things that we can do or say to build our confidence, to have the conversations that you've all mentioned, and to try and break that bias with that this time next year, we're not picking up where we left off today. We've made a lot of progress. So how can we do that? So I'm not gonna pick someone first to speak. So I'll let you choose who wants to answer that question first.
Whatever you're saying, never think that you're going to say the wrong thing, because there's times I go on the radio or go on TV and then I come off and people go, I can't believe you said that. And I went, was that bad? Shouldn't have said that. Because what you're saying and what it is you think in your opinion, because you know this, you know the subject, you know your community, you know this inside out. So if you have said that your opinion is valid, don't ever doubt yourself and say, I shouldn't say this because people might think that I'm too forward or too cheeky or whatever. You can never be too forward or too cheeky. I mean, Cathy, as a woman in politics, and you'll know that when you go into a room, they might send people from outside of your area to speak, and what they're going to say, they might be the most educated people in the world, but they don't know that community, they don't know the people that they're speaking to. So if you're in any situation where you're from that community, you're the woman who's been doing the work on the ground, not getting the credit for it, well then speak up and let them know, you know. Don't let the men in suits look down on you and make you think that you're somehow less worthy.
And Coumilah, to pick up on that, what would you say?
Society has told me that I wasn't good enough, and I believed it for a very long time. And it took me so long to actually realize that I was good enough. But by the time that I realized I was good enough, there was a lot of structural barriers. So I think what I want everyone to think about is also just believe in yourself. People are going to talk regardless of what you say and do, and wherever you are, they're going to talk regardless of that. So you do you.
You do you. Good advice. Dorinnia, you're closest to me. I'll go to you next. What would your words of wisdom be?
I think just drawing on what others have said and listening to Breda again this morning, you know, society does need female voices. You know, diversity is about just everyone's opinion. So it is about be yourself, and don't be afraid to be yourself, because, you know, we are good enough. So be yourself.
And we have a contribution to make. And last word to you, Karen.
Yeah, I think in this room is such great potential, and I would want to maximise on the whole power of story. I think that everybody in here has a story. And listen, this isn't about hanging all our dirty laundry out in a line for everybody to see, but it's recognising that your story and your journey has shaped you, and the importance of your voice. I grew up in a culture and a religious background that constantly told me that I was born to be silent, which is difficult for someone who is a very quiet person. But somewhere in that, I have done my whole life with people. And you need your sisters. You need your mentors. Pulling close to those people who will kick you up the bum, who will give you a slap, well, not a slap, but give you a kick whenever you've done something wrong, who cheers you on, who's got your back, who dusts you down, and begin to look at your story and think, how can I be the change? How can I begin to move forward and step into this?
Great advice. Thank you so much to all of you. Round of applause, please, for our panel. Wait, there was so much more we wanted to talk about today, but we've run out of time. So we maybe pick all of that up this time next year. But in the meantime, there's a lot of homework to be done in the room. So round of applause again for Karen, Alison, Coumilah and Dorinnia.